Well, hello again. This particular lecture session is for RL 225, Mystics, Saints, and Sinners, Studies in Medieval Catholic Culture. And as per your worksheets, dear students, this lecture session corresponds to week number 10. And it leads us to our third debate of the medieval period, Fides versus ratio, faith versus reason, or attempting to prove the existence of the divine based on reason alone, not based on any divinely revealed religion. You will recall from our discussion of the universitas invented in this period, the medieval period, that as these different faculties and disciplines came to be developed, the third discipline to be developed was the discipline of philosophy itself. The impetus being that more and more thinkers, again, not just among Christians in medieval Europe and Christendom, but even among, at the same time, Jewish thinkers, Islamic thinkers, that any attempt for any of those particular religions to prove or demonstrate that the divine God exists as a basis for justifying human-made laws is becoming a bit problematic. That is, people are sooner, probably rather than later, going to start waking up and perhaps not exactly believing these justifications, that is, theological justifications for human-made laws. And in this process of thinking and the introduction of this new faculty in the university system of philosophy, many thinkers of all three of these monotheistic religious traditions engage in a very complicated and wholehearted attempt at doing precisely that, namely demonstrating, proving the existence of the divine based on reason alone, without the crutch, the support of faith, irrespective, regardless of one's religious affiliation. There are, for our purposes in this course, three moments, if you will, in this debate, in the evolution of the ideas that constitute this debate. The first begins before the medieval period. And for that, we have to go all the way back to the 4th century BCE. 4th century BCE, the cosmological argument, promoted famously by these Western philosophers, ancient Greek philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, right? 4th century BCE. And historians of philosophy refer to this as the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument. Cosmological, what does this word mean? logos, rational, logical principle about something. About what? First half of the word, cosmos, which really does mean what we think of today as not just the universe, but now what theoretical physicists are tending more towards in their own research, maybe even a multiverse. In any event, I emphasize this because sometimes cosmos is translated as world. Well, that's true if your understanding of world is just planet Earth, or just our solar system, or just our Milky Way galaxy, etc., etc. But the concept cosmos for the ancient Greeks, and the ancient Romans for that matter, means just everything. Okay. So the cosmological argument, what does this exactly propose? It proposes that as one observes the cosmos, it seems that as we watch the sun rise, the sun set, it rains, trees grow, grass grows, cows eat the grass, cows defecate into the grass, cows die and decompose into the grass, the sun rises, the sun sets, it rains, trees grow, the grass grows. You get the idea. There seems to be causation, it's called. There seems to be a cause for everything else, like a domino effect. And if we trace this all the way back, we must eventually come to an uncaused cause. This is the heart of the so-called cosmological argument. If it's not clicked in your minds already, I guess that's kind of what I'm partly here for, to help you out. There's two serious problems with this line of reasoning, if we want to call it that. The first, the argument from causation, has a problem because of these two principles, approaches to knowing. How do we know something? How do we think we know something? Which historians of philosophy in Latin refer to as a priori knowledge versus a posteriori knowledge. A priori knowledge, right? By means of first things, all those abstract concepts that cannot be in any way demonstrated really in a laboratory, a so-called scientific experimental setting. Ideas, abstract ideas, freedom, justice, love, whatever. Yet they're obviously so ingrained within the collective human psyche that various races, ethnicities, cultural traditions, etc., around the world for the past several millennia have been debating, arguing, discussing, thinking, believing, holding precious these things. In any event, the problem is it's all ultimately in the mind, hence a priori. It's kind of somewhere out there, not really in the ether, but it's abstract. Okay, that's as opposed to a posteriori knowledge. That is by means of later, posterior things after the fact. Contemporary society would call it, although rather ignorantly, the stuff of scientific empirical knowledge. That is, can you give me something that I can observe, I can make an hypothesis, I can experiment with it, test it, draw conclusions, etc. The empirical method, a posteriori. The first problem then with the cosmological argument is that it's purely a priori. It's abstract. And that leads to the second problem with this cosmological argument. And the two kind of go hand in hand. There's a paradox involved here. Something which violates what logicians like to refer to, historians of philosophy like to refer to as the violation of the law of contradiction, or the law of non-contradiction, depending on which particular philosopher you read. Critical thinking moment. Can you guess what it is? Can you figure it out? First problem, the cosmological argument is a priori. That is, we're making empirical, if you will, a posteriori observations of the cosmos around us and in which we are part. And it's leading us to rather presumptuous a priori conclusions. That is, it seems that there is a cause for everything happening, which can be followed, traced back to an ultimate cause. Herein lies the paradox. Can you figure it out? Don't worry, we're going to come to that, but I just hope you're thinking. Ooh, squeeze your brain. Okay, so that's the first major point in this evolution of this debate between the medieval debate between Fides versus ratio, faith versus reason. This also, finally, before coming to the second point, the cosmological argument. This is what philosophers in the past couple of centuries like to refer to as deism. D-E-I-S-M, from the Latin term deus, meaning God. But what contemporary philosophers for the last couple of centuries intend by deism is that there is a divine nous, in Greek, intelligence, which has given rise to everything. But it's just some kind of vague, divine, metaphysical, beyond the physical intelligence, whatever that means. But it's abstract. It's just like a super brain or something out there. All right, that leads us then to the second of these 3 points in this debate in the medieval period, faith versus reason. And that is, as you look at your worksheets, number 3.B, the ontological argument. The ontological argument. Logos, rational, logical principle regarding what? First half of the word, ontos, a Greek word meaning being. Ontological argument. This is where it becomes even more problematic, because this is what contemporary philosophers, historians of philosophy of the past few centuries refer to as theism. Theism, not deism. Theism, T-H-E-I-S-M, from the Greek word theos, meaning God. Well, what's the difference between deism with a D and theism with a T-H? Literally a leap of faith. Because theism proposes that there not only is a divine intelligence, as the deists purport, but that divine intelligence is also a divine personal being that has created the cosmos, that gets involved in its own creation of the cosmos, for good and for bad. And of course, we see this throughout all sorts of religious traditions, mythologies, etc. Just think of the ancient Greeks. Some gods are not just divine intelligences, but they're divine personal beings who get involved more often than not, for good and for bad. In any event, the idea here is that we're jumping from just some sort of a divine abstract intelligence to a divine personal being. That's the ontological argument. And that's really where things pick up then in the medieval period regarding this attempt at demonstrating, proving the existence of the divine, the existence of God, based on reason alone. Again, as you look at your worksheets, you'll see a couple of names here. The more famous proponents of this were the Islamic thinker already in the 10th century, Al-Farabi, or Al-Farabius in Latin. The Jewish rabbinic thinker, Moshe Maimonides, or Moses Maimonides, we usually say in English. And this third one, the Christian archbishop, former Benedictine monk from the northwestern part of Italy, the Piedmont region, Piemonte, like Torino, Turin. Anselmo, or in English, he's usually referred to as Anselm, because he would wind up being made the Archbishop of Canterbury all the way up in England. Anselm of Canterbury. And the ontological argument then is often referred to imprecisely as Anselm's argument. Anselm didn't come up with this idea on his own, but it's attributed to him certainly in the Western tradition, from the Western perspective, because he made it famous. And the reason why he really made it famous is because of his, and this is unique to him, original to him, his particular formulation, attempting to do it based on reason alone, for what such a divine personal being is, hence the ontological argument. In other words, Anselm of Canterbury is the first guy that tries to give a definition of God. What is Anselm's definition of God? Remember, he's coming from the Christian tradition, mind you. Anselm says, you want a definition of what God is? Here it is. Quote, I'll just give it to you in English. God is that being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Again, God is that being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Again, by conceived, we mean being able to be thought of in the mind. And therein is the first problem here with Anselm's particular ontological argument. It's in the mind. In other words, it remains a priori. This was already picked up on at the time. Anselm sent his papers around. You've read one of them, the Proslogion. Maybe you read others as well that I sent, but that was the one of the readings we were supposed to do for the course. throughout different monasteries, Benedictine monasteries, remember the Schola. We're still here at the time before the university develops, really. And this problem is already picked up on by many other thinkers in Christian medieval Europe at the time. Most famously, a guy who actually responds to Anselm, a French monk by the name of Gonilo. It's usually just crassly pronounced in English, Gonilo. And Gonilo says, with all due respect, Anselm, your argument is just, it's bullshit. And his reason for doing so is this idea of what Gonilo says is the perfect island. That is to say, I'm thinking, right, you're thinking of God, okay, that being than which nothing greater can be conceived. I'm thinking of a perfect island. Perfect. What happens then when someone else discovers another island, which is not only in my mind more perfect, but a posteriori more perfect? In other words, Anselm's argument is problematic because it remains a priori. In other words, Anselm has not resolved this issue. Consequently, Gonilo makes this response, his perfect island argument. I sometimes, when we used to be in aula, I would ask the question, how many of you, when you were, little you, like really little you, used to play with My Little Ponies? And don't worry, it is 2020, we're all inclusive here, so. My Little Pony. What's a My Little Pony? I don't know, it's a unicorn. Sometimes has wings. Do unicorns, especially flying unicorns, do those exist in reality? Notwithstanding various experimentations on chimeras. Anyway, I digress. Do flying unicorns exist? No. You can think of it, you can see it, you can visualize it, but does it exist in reality? No. So that's Gonilo's idea of the perfect island, right? Yeah, it's in the mind, but that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean it exists. To which Anselm responds, well, there are two kinds and degrees of existence, of being. What is in the mind and what is in reality. And if something does exist in reality, it necessarily means it exists in the mind. And therefore, the greater of these two types of existence, purely in the mind or in the mind and in reality, or in reality and necessarily, therefore, in the mind, in the intellect, the greater of these two is the latter. Right? It exists both in the mind and in reality. And that's what God is. And his reason for saying so, Anselm's reason for saying so, because someone will respond like the perfect island argument, well, okay, if I ask all of you, in your minds, try to imagine God. One of you says, well, this is God. Another one says, no, this is God. And we can actually debate this intellectually, mentally. Oh, that does look like a better or more powerful or omnipotent, better God, right? Anselm responds, well, then that's God. Well, I'm thinking of a more godly God. Well, then that's God. I think you see how this argument is kind of devolving. And in fact, in the end, this is the real kicker. In the end, excuse me, Anselm says, fortunately, we have the confidence, the assurance that what I am proposing, supposedly based on reason alone, de ratione, just on reason alone, this is all true because of de fide, concerning faith, meaning divine revelation. We know this is true because we have the support of divine revelation. Wait a minute. I thought we started on this whole journey because we were trying to demonstrate the existence, at least, of a divine intelligence, if not a divine personal being, based on reason alone. No. Anselm's particular take on the ontological argument, and for that matter, any other ontological argument, they don't hold water. Pure and simple. And, of course, there are many religious apologists that still attempt to use this argument today because it's very easy, it's clever, it's convenient on the surface, but if you scratch that surface and go underneath, considering we're trying to do this based on reason alone, one immediately realizes it completely falls apart. But hey, at least it gives philosophers, for the time being anyway, a full salaried paycheck from the academic industrial complex of their particular choice.